It is a very easy thing to argue that a person deserves enough money to live, and that if they're a worker, they deserve to work in an environment that is safe, comfortable, and well maintained. That is a logical and morally upright thing to expect. However, arguing morality with a capitalist is a lot like discussing vegan options with the tiger that's eating your face. I am more interested in articulating a few of the dynamics at play that I think are important for somebody on the left to be aware of, and to provide arguments that can be used to reach those non-political people who might be fairly passive on unions more generally. Without a deeper understanding of the union's functionality in a capitalist system, those relying on the media for news and views could perhaps be poisoned against them over time, as previous generations were by an avalanche of bad press and propaganda. Now, I'm not interested so much in the moral or political case for unions. These are pretty self-explanatory, particularly if you're already on the left. So instead, I'm looking to argue that unions are both necessary and inevitable for a liberal democracy under capitalism. So with that in mind, for every section of the video, we will be returning to the question, why does this make unions necessary? Hopefully, by the end of this video, you'll be able to answer that question yourself. I've recently done a 5-minute video on the profit motive, which you can find linked up here. But let's just recap the key points. In a capitalist society, businesses seek to create profit, which is defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as a financial gain, especially the difference between the amount earned and the amount spent in buying, operating, or producing something. Now, I have heard a rumour that someone may have written a book on exactly how this profit is created, but we aren't going to get into that today. Instead, we are going to stay on target and look into how the pursuit of profit affects the behaviour of an employer by exploring something called the profit motive. If we hop onto Wikipedia, it gives us the following. The reason for a business's existence is to turn a profit. Businesses seek to benefit themselves and/or their shareholders by maximising profits. So the profit motive is given as a business's ultimate goal, its driving force and its guiding light. It exists not only to turn a profit, but to ensure every decision is made through the lens of maximising profit. It is not especially hard to see how this might create a possibility for conflict between those trying to maximise profit and, well, everybody else. It is, in fact, arguable that the profit motive is responsible for an awful lot of conflict in wider society. Again, I think someone might have said something about this. Some would argue that the profit motive is not a bad thing. If we were to head over to wallstreetmojo.com, we can see what they think of the positives of the profit motive in a section they call Why It's Important. They say, taxes collected from profitable businesses contribute to government revenue. Profitable businesses create jobs. It is the foundation of economic and entrepreneurial activities. Therefore, earning more and more contributes to the economy. Individuals with a profit-reaping mindset become more creative. They invent and innovate. And profit is directly proportional to risk. The more risk involved, the more the profit potential. This idea has encouraged many businesses to think out of the box. These virtues of the profit motive are all arguable. Of course they are. But they are easy to understand and possess a sort of logic that is easy to process for someone that is not especially invested in politics or economics. They are a good summation of the pro-capitalist arguments for competition and the profit motive, and it's important that we acknowledge that there is a large slice of society that are big fans of this logic ideologically, even if they themselves do not benefit from it directly. Now, these are one of the groups of people that we can reach, since they have no material connection to this philosophy and are simply operating off of the only argument that is allowed to be presented in the mainstream media. Now, why does this make unions necessary? Going back to our definitions of the profit motive itself, businesses are effectively profit engines. They think only of profit. Everything else is an expense that should be squeezed to maximise profit. And this logic is coded into the very DNA of private enterprise. Labour, or the worker, is fuel for this engine, and the cost of that fuel should be minimised as much as possible to allow the engine to produce more profit. So what is there that stops employers paying poverty wages and forcing workers to toil in terrible conditions for 100 hours a week? Kindness, I guess. So what happens if you try to discuss the welfare of workers with a private business owner and you try to appeal to their sense of fairness? For that, we'll consider the corporation, as close to an avatar of capitalism made flesh that you can get, a pure distillation of the profit motive, and frankly just a weird and Frankensteinish thing that I always enjoy talking about. To Wikipedia. A corporation is an organisation authorised by the state to act as a single entity, a legal entity recognised by private and public law, born out of statute, a legal person in legal context, and recognised as such in law for certain purposes. So it's sort of a profit golem, or automaton, but wait, there's more. Limited liability means that a passive shareholder in a corporation will not be personally liable either for contractually agreed obligations of the corporation or for torts, involuntary harms, committed by the corporation against a third party. So it's like a profit golem, automaton, or profit-eating zombie that you have limited control over, but you can't be held responsible for. Let's keep going. Despite not being human beings, corporations have been ruled legal persons in a few countries, have many of the same rights as natural persons do. For example, a corporation can own property, and can sue or be sued for as long as it exists. Corporations can exercise human rights against real individuals and the state. They can themselves be responsible for human rights violations. Right. Okay. And these capitalist vessels, these man-made monsters, they can be good too, right? Like, they aren't innately evil or anything, are they? This article from Psychology Today in 2011 says, if corporations are indeed persons, their mental condition can accurately be described as pathological. Corporations have no innate moral impulses, and in fact they exist solely for the purpose of making money. As such, these persons are systematically driven to do whatever is necessary to increase revenues and profits, with no regard for ethical issues that might nag real people. But corporations don't run themselves, do they? I mean, they're run by a board made up of human beings, so they would stop it if the officers and directors who run corporations are actually duty-bound to act in the corporation's best financial interest, and that means they are obliged to do whatever they can within the law to make money. Thus, this fiduciary duty requires corporate management to set aside ethical niceties when they get in the way of corporate profits. Or, to put it into the words of the Corporation author Joel Buchan, you have these huge and powerful institutions, compelled by their institutional characters to pursue self-interest regardless of the consequences, bent on avoiding or pushing out of the way anything that impedes their missions, such as regulations, taxes and public provision, creating wealth for anonymous and unaccountable shareholders and with no democratic accountability to the people other than their shareholders, affected by their decisions and actions. So this is looking a tall order. I mean, how do you argue with someone who only listens to their shareholders and is only driven by profit? Add in the fact that this person fits the characterization of a psychopath, and well, it's a bit bleak, isn't it? How much empathy can you expect from a psychopath? To Wikipedia. Psychopathy, sometimes considered synonymous with sociopathy, is characterized by persistent antisocial behavior, impaired empathy and remorse, and bold, disinhibited and egotistical traits. Why does all this make unions necessary? I think we can all agree that expecting a corporation to act in the interest of its staff out of some sense of loyalty or goodwill is both something of a long shot and frankly not functionally built into the mechanisms of a profit-motivated business. We have seen that privately owned businesses can't be trusted to make the right decisions by their workers. When we think about the state being an economic actor, it has a lot of levers it can pull to impact the flow of money, whether it be from printing money, investing in key areas, changing legislations, redistributing wealth, etc., etc. It also has things such as minimum wage, environmental protections, and the Working Time Directive that it can use to protect the paying conditions of the average worker, speaking in the UK at least. As an employer, the UK state has around 5.7 million workers in its employ at the moment, so it could demonstrate good practices and pay a genuine living wage, effectively using its status as one of the largest employers in the world to force private companies to improve or have their workers leave and join the state's employ instead. Effectively, the state could be a big player in the labour market, able to influence those around it in the business of competing for workers. If the government has the power to distribute wealth to those less wealthy, to redirect investment to areas of the country in need of support, and to demonstrate how to be an exemplary employer by being one, Why doesn't it? Governments are theoretically beholden only to the electorate, so anything that benefits the people should be a no-brainer, right? There isn't an owner as such. There's a monarch, sort of, and no shareholders to speak of, other than perhaps us voters. Perhaps most importantly, there is no profit being sought by a government. So the profit motive shouldn't be a factor in their decision-making. But then, that's the trick, isn't it? When you talk about a government, we talk about it as being one entity, but it is in fact many individuals, and individuals can have influences that affect their decision-making process. The personal financial interests of MPs and Lords, for example, are often entangled with decisions made in Parliament, with many sitting on boards or having related investments in businesses affected by state action. A lot of these entanglements aren't even considered problematic, and the carousel of ministers moving from big corporations to government and then back again seems to be moving ever faster, with few in the media or government raising much concern at all. We're going to look at a few headlines now. So we've got one from The Standard. Revealed. MPs earn 17.1 million on top of their salaries since the last election. Data shows Tory politicians made an extra 15.2 million, whilst Labour MPs earned 1.2 million in additional income. And this from The Telegraph. BBC chairman's appointment to be reviewed after Boris Johnson loan claims. Commissioner of Public Appointments announces review after claims Richard Sharp helped to arrange a guarantee on a loan of up to £800,000. And then we have iNews. More than 100 MPs are earning at least 2.6 million a year between them from renting out properties, research finds. Given the familiarity with the business world, it is perhaps of little surprise to learn that many maintain those connections during office, and this can create issues regarding lobbying, access to state decision makers, and political donations. All of these levers can be used to apply pressure to the state, and to help guide legislation, budgetary considerations and policy into areas that better suit the profit motive of those able to afford such pressure. Big business will understand the benefits of funding certain MPs, parties and conferences, and will use donor leverage to then gain access to MPs as a lobbying entity, with lobbying essentially being a way to legitimise private entities influencing public institutions in ways that ordinary people simply aren't able to. Almost half of UK political donations come from private wealthy super donors, new research finds. A new study reveals the growing influence of wealthy individuals in political affairs, particularly in the affairs of the Conservative Party. The report also highlights a growing inequality between the financial resources of the two leading parties, which could have significant effects for democracy over the long term. Moving on, we've got one from Open Democracy here. 20% of UK political donations come from just 10 men. Exclusive. 10 men with an average age of 70, most of whom are white, gave 106 million, while women gave just 1 in 4 political donations. And then there's the media, which reflects the ideologies and mandates of its owners, most of whom are also heavily invested in the business world too, meaning we are getting a lot of our information via the profit motives lens. For example, going to The Guardian, extra level of power. Billionaires who have bought up the media. Elon Musk joins a list of men to use their wealth in the hope of extending their political influence. Open Democracy UK. 5 reasons why we don't have a free and independent press in the UK and what we can do about it. Britain's press is controlled by the same networks of people as run everything else. Is it really free? The media can apply pressure to MPs individually and collectively, and is able to have a significant effect on public perception, and as such is a powerful tool to ensure that political parties do not drift too far from what is considered tenable. As a reminder of how the media can create or destroy political power, let's remind ourselves of some of the following instances. First from HuffPost, how a bacon sandwich derailed Ed Miliband's UK political career. One seriously awkward photo op will haunt the former leader of Britain's Labour Party forever. Then from the BBC, Jeremy Corbyn should be open over spies' claims, says Theresa May in 2018. And then finally from The Guardian, I shouldn't have read the papers so much when I was PM. He suffered at the hands of journalists. Now former Prime Minister John Major talks candidly to a distinguished political writer about his fears for the press and his anger at the Blair media machine. Please don't think too much about him saying this to journalists. Obviously he didn't think about it that much, so neither should we. So why does all this make unions necessary? When you examine the workings of the state, via the lens of its many influences, pressures and biases, it reveals that it is far from insulated from the motivations of the business owners and media. The line between the democratic and economic functions of society have become blurred to such a degree that we cannot assume any action taken by the state can be viewed as independent. We have so far examined a number of reasons for all of this, but there is one I've deliberately omitted so far so that we could give it its own section. Marx. There, I said it. I was going to have to mention it eventually, so sorry if you aren't a fan, but we do need to talk about class. I've done another short video about class interest specifically, which you can find up here, but let's have a quick look at the basics in relation to this video. Within society, there are groups of people with shared goals or shared interests, and these groups can be expected to act in accordance with those shared interests, both as a matter of their own welfare and as a wider enrichment of those they identify with. For example, in the UK, it can be said that the vast majority of people's lives would be improved by lower rents and mortgages, higher wages, and better funded public services, and these would be considered a shared or class interest. However, there is a much smaller group of people who happen to own most of those houses, businesses and privatised public services who would want the opposite of all those things to ensure they gain the maximum profit from them, a la the profit motive. This smaller group has a disproportionate share of the wealth, power and influence, and has contradictory class interests to the majority, so it is to their own advantage to ensure that circumstances aren't allowed to change, and they will position themselves to do just that. They will act in their class interest. By ensuring that those raised in wealth and privilege get to the top positions of the media, government and businesses, their class interest is well served and can maintain itself. If you look into the number of privately schooled people in these industries, the number with wealthy or comfortable family upbringing, and the sheer amount of nepotism that goes on, it quickly becomes very clear how our country's state of inequality is maintained. Mick Wright recently shared a PDF of his own creation based on journalistic nepotism that really spelled out just how captured by the ownership class journalism is. And this capture of influential institutions can be seen in the very circumstances under which we live. It would be very simple, for example, to make having a home a human right in this country, investing in social housing, criminalising evictions, and in doing so removing the dominion of housing away from predatory landlords and developers. You could almost entirely eliminate homelessness. However, the opposite has happened, with social housing now a tiny percentage of the housing market, almost as if the threat of homelessness is a vital part of the continuance of the current system. Which it definitely is, by the way. Let's not be coy about this. Homelessness and the threat of it is how wages are kept low. It benefits the business owners who share a class interest with many politicians, media owners, and etc. etc. Why does this make unions necessary? With all of these factors in mind, such as the drive for profit, the aligned class interest of business owners, shareholders and government, and the imbalance in wealth, power and influence, can we rely on employers making fair, rational, reasonable choices on the pay and conditions of their workers? No. We can't. Is it even fair for us to expect an employer, with the many internal and external pressures pushing for maximal profit extraction, to go against all that in favour of the workers? The contradiction of the workplace is that on one side we have the owners, driven by the profit motive to reduce costs and exploit every resource for its maximum possible profit. And then we have the workers, who need a decent wage and working conditions in return for their labour. No, not the perpetually disappointing political party. Instead, I speak of the ability to produce value for an employer. As defined by Britannia.com, labour means any valuable service rendered by a human agent in the production of wealth, other than accumulating and providing capital or assuming the risks that are a normal part of business undertakings. This all sounds very familiar again. The worker agrees to sell a certain amount of their labour in exchange for a salary and an agreed set of conditions and benefits. Having already established the profit motive, class interest and the disparity in influence and power between a worker and their employer, the only means the worker has to influence the decision making of the employer is to strike, or, to put it another way, to withhold their labour, which is the one element needed to create the value the employer wants. However, one worker is vulnerable, as any one worker could theoretically be replaced by another should they refuse to work and withdraw their labour. And why does this make unions necessary? The threat of poverty and homelessness will always ensure that there will be someone willing to take a low-wage, poor conditions job, so a single worker standing up for their own interest is taking a huge risk. And the entire system we live under is built around this concept. For any one person to be able to resist the power of the business-owning class and their chums in the media and government, they would need to somehow coordinate their action with other workers, their families and their dependents. With so many pressures pushing for maximal profit generation, for exploiting every possible loophole, market and resource and cutting every cost, it's simply not realistic to then rely on the embedded system to balance itself. Why would those benefiting the most from this status quo choose to act against those pressures based on some form of altruistic principle? They wouldn't, and they largely don't. For this system to persist, and for it to not descend into instability and chaos, there needs to be a systematic way of balancing the drive for profit with the needs of workers to be compensated adequately. As we have seen so far, there exists no government safeguard or any bargaining chip that the worker can use. What would happen, however, if a group of workers were to coordinate the withdrawal of their power so that they could represent a bigger gap in labour supply than can be absorbed by the local market? That would be an act of worker solidarity, and the beginning of collective bargaining. That would be a union. Let's quickly define some terms here. So union, if we go to the Oxford Dictionary, a union is a society or association formed by people with a common interest or purpose. We also mentioned the phrase collective bargaining. As per the Oxford Dictionary, is the negotiation of wages and other conditions of employment by an organised body of employees. To put it simply, unions allow for shared or class interests to be represented by a single entity, harnessing the collective will and power of its members to ensure their views can be represented in a material way, and in a way that can't be ignored, since it affects the very thing a business is preoccupied with: profit. Why does this make unions necessary? One worker withholding 8 hours of labour time might be easy to absorb for a business, but 100 workers doing the same, on the same site on the same day, can create a deficit of 800 hours. Suddenly, an employer has to acknowledge their grievances or swallow a substantial hit to their ability to create profit. It is merely a matter of the business deciding what will be the greater cost to them: lost production due to striking, or raising wages and conditions. Restricting profit through coordinated labour withdrawal is the only way an ordinary person can directly influence the employer and be afforded the protection of a collective at the same time. There isn't really an alternative. Unions are the yin to the owner class's yang, providing the requisite balance to a system stacked massively in favour of those that own the majority of the wealth. What I hope you have gathered from the various aspects discussed in this video is that there are a number of reasons that a capitalist system can't be trusted to provide fair wages and working conditions for workers, and in reality it shouldn't be expected to. If you build an entire economic framework based around the profit motive and the maximisation of that profit, all other considerations will be minimised, and someone once spelt out the inevitability of such a system. The union is the only direct tool that we ordinary folk have access to, and the only way that we can make sure that people are paid correctly for their labour in workplaces that are safe, comfortable and well maintained. The withdrawal of labour is an act of solidarity. It is an act of collective love, mutual respect, and an acknowledgement that if we stand together, we can face up against any monolithic profit-chasing entity and meet it blow for blow. Sometimes strikes make our life a bit harder. They disrupt our routines and it can be frustrating, I get it. But ultimately every single strike is for all of us. Each successful strike reinforces the power of labour, the worker and the common person, and reminds the owners of capital that others with shared interests will not let them have it all their own way. So the next time you hear of striking workers, lend your voice, show your solidarity, and add your strength to theirs in any way you can. Every strike is for all of us. Join a union. Solidarity with all striking workers. Thank you for joining me today on what was probably the most challenging video to put together so far. There are so many concepts, layers, complications, biases and overlapping interests when talking about a subject like this. There is a temptation to go overboard and dig into everything and just end up making a sprawling mess that loses sight of its original purpose. Hopefully that isn't what's happened here, but time will tell, I suppose. If you did enjoy the content, please give it a like. It really helps the video get out there and fight the algorithm for a place. Subscribe if you'd like to see more content. Point this video out to some people if you think they need a bit of a nudge to look up, more on unions and why they're important. Hopefully one day we can dump capitalism and I won't need to explain why we need unions to protect us from it. But until then, join a union, stay active in your community, talk to each other. We have more in common than we don't. See you soon.